Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar today on wholesale and retail demand response. This webinar will run for about 75 minutes or so, during which time we'll have 4 presentations covering first the basics of demand response, and then measurement and verification associated with demand response programs. All the phone lines for you, the audience, are muted. If you do have any questions, though, please type them into the text box, and we'll do our best to get them answered. The webinar is being recorded, though, and the recording and slides will be available at the LBNL webinar website, which is listed here and will be listed on other sites as well, perhaps as early as later today or even tomorrow. I do want to mention that this funding for the webinar is from the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. LBNL is coordinating this series with input from and collaboration with the Department of Energy, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the National Association of State Energy Officials, who I sincerely want to thank for their support for these webinars. I also want to thank our outreach sponsors that include the International Energy Program Evaluation Conference, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and the regional energy efficiency offices, including the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, and the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, which, by the way, is having their spring EM&V forum meeting in Washington on April 27th. You can learn about the forum by Googling NEEP EM. So, as an introduction, please let me start off by saying that my name is Steve Schill, and I'm an affiliate and senior advisor in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I've worked in the energy industry for many years, and a great deal of that time has been focused on efficiency and demand response and distributed generations. One of my areas of focus is evaluation, measurement, and verification, or EM&V, and I'm fortunate to be the facilitator of this webinar series. The Berkeley Lab, which is hosting these webinars, is supported by DOE to conduct non-classified research, and is operated by the University of California. We also provide technical assistance to states, primarily state energy offices and utility regulatory commissions. But before I say a few words about the technical assistance, though, let me just mention our standard disclaimer here, which essentially says that DOE, LBL, university, and pretty much anyone who's ever known or ever will know me takes no responsibility for what I or the other speakers are going to be saying. On that technical assistance, LBL provides independent and unbiased technical support for state utility commissions, state energy offices, tribes, and other regional entities in a wide range of energy areas such as efficiency and demand response, renewables, and grid topics. Our contact information is here on the website, and for those who can't write too fast, these slides will be available on the LBL EM&V webinar site where you registered for this webinar. And if not, you can again just Google LBL EM&V webinars. Whoops, we went one too many here. I'll come back, I hope. There we go. So this webinar series. These webinars are designed to support activities for documenting energy savings and impacts of efficiency programs, and in this case, demand response included in that. As mentioned before, it's funded by DOE, and I want to thank EPA and NARUC and NASIO. This is actually our 8th webinar in the series, and the prior ones with the audio and slides are up on the EM&V webinar site. Our target audience for these are utility commissions and state energy offices, environmental departments, and nonprofits operating EE portfolios, but of course we also welcome everyone, including the program administrators, consultants, and such. Our next webinar is tentatively scheduled for the end of May. I'll be talking about advances in efficiency EM&V on DOE's Uniform Methods project and what some call EM&V 2.0. So now let's turn to today's webinar. On this figure, the slide shows electric load for a utility customer. In green, that's the load, and that drop that occurs midday in this particular graphic is in response to some form of demand response signal. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, and you'll see this type of figure shown again, so I'm not going to dwell on it. I just want to go over quickly as an introduction that, demand response, what is it? It's been known for some time that the electricity system is kind of like relationships, and it takes two to tango. In this case, it's the demand side and the supply side. And demand response is one of those resources on the demand side or some call it the grid edge. Other demand-side resources can include efficiency and distributed generation, distributed storage, and of course pricing signals. But DR specifically is this broad category of resources that allow electricity consumers to increase or decrease demand at certain times when such action would be helpful and supportive of the utility grid network. So why do we want to do this? Well, it just really supports a wide range of grid needs, such as capacity and improved reliability, reduced wholesale and retail costs, and it's really helpful for the grid with higher levels of distributed generation, particularly those with variable output, such as certain renewables. And secondly, the grid modernization that's occurring with technology and data and access to these technologies and data is expanding the demand response capabilities and potential benefits, which turns us to why measurement and verification. Simply put, M&V is a fundamental aspect of demand response as assessing changes in electricity consumption resulting from these DR pricing and incentive programs is quite critical element in assessing their value and improving performance. And for system operators and resource planners, making sure DR is delivering as a resource as reliable and secure. So that's what we're going to be talking about through today. As we get going here, I want to start off with this poll, which hopefully you're seeing on your screens here. Just get a sense for our audience. If you could respond and just let us know whether you're currently working with DR or considering it, that would be great. And we'll just keep this open for another half a minute here. You can see, for most of you, you're able to see as you can respond online on the screen there. We're up to about 3/4 of the folks have responded, so I'm going to close the poll here. I think you hopefully all can see this, that virtually 60% of our participants are working with DR, and another 20% are looking to do it in the future. So with that, let me move on to our speakers today. I'll introduce each as they start, but we're going to have two presentations on basics and then two presentations getting more into detail about measurement and verification. So with that, let me introduce Jennifer Potter. She's a Senior Scientific Engineering Associate at LBL. She conducts research on demand response and time-based pricing. She's currently working on the California Demand Response Potential Study. And prior to LBL, Jenny worked at Sacramento Municipal Utility District, and she's been working for over a decade on all types of utility customer usage and efficiency and demand response work. She has a master's in public policy from Carnegie Mellon. So with that, Jenny, I'll let you click on your slide and take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. Today I'm going to talk about the retail side of demand response programs. We kind of broke this into two pieces. I'm going to tackle the retail demand response programs, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who will talk to you about the wholesale side of demand response. So not to be redundant and repetitive, but just going to give a different definition, but pretty much the same as what Steve mentioned earlier. We are defining demand response, and in this case, retail demand response, as a mechanism through which we control an end user's load profile, typically with price signals or with automated control. And this can be done by the user, a third party, or a utility. And once again, this is in response to system needs, either at the distribution level for retail demand response or at the transmission level. And typically this is done in return for economic compensation. There's an additional component here, which is behavioral demand response, which uses notifications or communications to motivate a customer to change their energy consumption behavior, but is typically does not include any type of economic or incentive payments. So moving on here, once again, just to reiterate, I'm going to focus on the retail side of demand response. And so pretty much we can break demand response into two parts. One is the wholesale market for demand response. The other is the retail side. In the case of retail demand response, this is typically procured and under the control of a utility, whether that's a distribution utility that operates in a deregulated energy market. They may or may not bid the DR resources into wholesale markets. And then a second type is your vertically integrated utility environment. This includes municipal-owned utility providers or investor-owned utilities. And then there's this third sort of category, which is our aggregators or energy services companies. And they subscribe customers on the behalf of a vertically integrated utility or a distribution utility as third parties for their DR services. So they directly subscribe utility customers into these programs. So categorizing the types of DR opportunities, we can really break these into and categorize them by the DR signal itself. So that is how we are sending a signal for low consumption patterns to change. The two categories include time-based rates and incentive-based programs. The first category includes things like time of use rates, where the rates differ by the period of the day or time of the day. And a CPP, for example, uses signals where the rate substantially increases during specific hours of the day, and they're usually only dispatched 10 to 20 times a year. And for the case of real-time pricing, this rate usually changes on an hourly basis, but it can be communicated a day in advance or in real time. In the second category, we present our incentive-based programs, which are programs that can be dispatched as system needs demand, but with the exception of behavioral DR, which is listed there, which, like I mentioned earlier, there's really no economic payment. For the other incentive-based programs, there are economic payments to those utility customers. For example, disconnectable programs are like those large industrial interruptible programs or smaller residential direct load control programs that rely on air conditioning control switches, where in both cases the customers cannot override the automated signal, where a configurable program would be something like a programmable communicating thermostat or a smart thermostat, where the customer has the ability to override the signal. This slide also shows examples of other specific programs under our characterization scheme, segmenting out the wholesale DR programs that are available in many ISO or RTO jurisdictions to retail customers. Since the focus of my presentation is on the retail DR programs, we'll leave the discussion of these wholesale market programs up to Dave Cathan, who, since energy bidding, capacity bidding, and ancillary services bidding are provided exclusively to the bulk power system. So this slide presents the current DR programs today as they can be categorized and basically in the attributes of their signals. This table summarizes each type of DR opportunity using 6 characteristics, including whether the opportunity allows for targeted geographic specificity, whether the signal allows for variability, how often it is available for dispatch, and whether the resource is enabled with automated controls. For example, a TOU rate relies on price signal that differs by periods of the hours of the day, which you can see in column 4, to induce a customer to alter their consumption of electricity. The level of the price signal in column 3 in each of the periods is predetermined. Time of use rates are usually designed at the service territory level by the utility, not based on where a customer is located on the distribution system, as in column 2. The utility does not require any automation or control technology for time of use rates, which is in column 7, to take service under the time of use rate, although customers may choose to invest in technologies to better manage their load while on such time-based pricing. So why do we do this? And Steve mentioned had a small discussion of this, but really why do we do retail demand response programs? They're procured by the utility to manage the needs on their distribution system, and there's a number of reasons why they do so. These include, but they're not limited to, maintaining system reliability and then reducing the cost of procuring power during the high price periods. In essence, minimizing their load shape and minimizing coincident transmission system peaks. They also can be used to address local reliability or congestion problems within the distribution system. And then also there's the up-and-coming sort of reason or rationale, which is a non-wires alternative, where their utilities are avoiding or deferring long-term capital investments. And of course, meeting contractual obligations is always a good reason to pursue DR programs as well. Great. And so a recent Peak Load Management Alliance, the PLMA Alliance, had offered a training services, and they provided an explanation of the evolution of demand response and categorized this evolution as demand response 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And I'm borrowing from their presentation of this evolution and building upon that framework here. So here in Demand Response 1.0, we examine historical demand response programs that can be 20 to 30 years old. These programs were managed by the utility, and they had little or no measurement or verification, meaning they still had their register reads and their electromechanical meters that were read on a monthly basis. So there really was no ability to see how a customer actually performed during an event. They were typically one-way communication load control devices, such as on an air conditioning unit. And in the case of large commercial customers, you would literally pick up a telephone or page them in order to ask them to curtail load during an event. There were also retail rates that have been used over the last 20 years that did encourage time-based consumption patterns or changes in those patterns, but they were typically used to increase efficiency or optimize the service level of each customer that was on the rate, not necessarily in order to meet a specific system need at the distribution or transmission level. So as we've moved through into Demand Response 2.0, which is where I think we are today, we have actually, if we think of demand response as sort of a pendulum, and that's how I view it, is in 1.0 we were on one side, and then now the pendulum has swung all the way to the other side in 2.0, where now most of the programs are actually bid into the wholesale electricity market, and they're used to manage a load at the grid, at the large system grid. So the role of retail demand response is actually decreased and is not as important as demand response 1.0, typically because we are bidding these programs into the market for either resource adequacy requirements or because of managing just contractual obligations or energy prices. So the measurement and verification has come a long way. We have AMI meters out in the field. We also have other technologies that are able to capture energy usage data and on intervals and provide that back to system operators. That has enabled us to really evaluate customer performance and place a value on it and what we should be paying for these types of services. The role of DR has moved into an increasingly flexible resource in the bulk power system. So, and once again, these programs that were once managed by utilities are now becoming a much larger player in the wholesale markets. So where are we going with this? So we're going into, I believe, 3.0. This evolution is going to take us into using DR to manage some of the local system grid needs in addition to bulk power system needs. So I think that pendulum is going to come about halfway back in between 1.0 and 2.0, and we're going to see it being DR being able to provide services not only at the bulk power system, but once again at the distribution system. One of the reasons for this and a big driver of that is the distributed energy resources penetration. They're really going to require localized, flexible retail DR programs, whether that's done through time-based pricing, once again, or using incentive-based mechanisms that have automated control that can help manage the volatility on the distribution systems. Once again, that non-wires alternative for deferring capital investments in distribution and transmission infrastructure, demand response will continue to play a significant role, if not increasing. And then we also have automated controls that are enabling curtailment, interruption, that can meet a more geographic specificity and how they're addressing needs on the grid. And that's something that, on that previous table I provided, we just aren't seeing at this time, that we're not able to deploy these in a surgical way where we're time-based rates where it's just system-wide offering. So with that, I will finish up, and thank you for allowing me to discuss retail DR programs.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jenny. Want to again mention we've got a few questions that have been coming in that I think we've been able to handle with individual text messages, but for the audience, if you do have questions either specific to the presentations or in general, please submit them via the text box. For our next presenter, we have Dr. David Cathan. He's an economist with the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Dave has joined the Commission in 2002 after about 20 years in energy consulting. And at FERC, he works on market design issues, including demand response and smart grid, pricing and distributed energy resource integration. He's been the project lead for the Commission's annual demand response report and was the staff lead on the National Action Plan on Demand Response. So with that, I want to ask Dave to take it away. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you, Jenny, for that great overview and introduction. As I am Dave Cathan, and I'm an economist in the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation here at FERC. As Steve mentioned, I've been in the Commission for about 15 years, and during that period, I've worked on many of the key demand response policies and cases. During my section of this webinar, I'll be reviewing wholesale demand response, FERC policies, and will briefly introduce wholesale demand response measurement and verification. But before I move on, I must state my disclaimer that the views that I express do not necessarily represent the views of the Commission or any commissioner. Okay, now that we got that over with, let's talk in specific about what has been happening in the wholesale level. I always like to start with definitions, and the definition of demand response adopted by the Commission and included in the Code of Federal Regulations is close to what Jenny showed, but it's slightly different. It states a reduction in the consumption of electric energy by customers from their expected consumption in response to an increase in the price of electric energy or to incentive payments designed to induce lower consumption of electric energy. So starting in 1999, the Commission has approved wholesale demand response proposals and programs developed by the ISOs and RTOs. These demand response programs can be grouped into four major categories: capacity market, ancillary services, demand bidding, and voluntary emergency demand response. I'll review each of these program types in more details in a few moments. I want to note that since 1999, these wholesale demand response programs have evolved. Early programs were reliability-based and were developed for the specific purpose of resource adequacy concerns, in particular in California during the early 2000s. As the capacity markets were implemented and the technologies got further developed in the United States, these programs have shifted and have become more economic and more focused on the capacity market programs. And then a final note, a key characteristic of wholesale demand response is the ability of demand response providers to aggregate customer demand reduction and then bid these reductions into the wholesale markets. Along with the FERC approval of ISO and RTO programs, the Commission has issued several demand response related orders. In 2008, FERC issued Order Number 719, which required changes to wholesale markets to permit demand response participation, particularly in ancillary services markets. It also allowed demand response aggregation, unless local laws or regulation do not permit a retail customer to participate. This is sometimes known as the opt-out provision. In 2011, FERC issued Order Number 745 on demand response compensation. It requires that demand response who are participating in energy markets be paid the same locational marginal price that other resources are paid, subject to conditions that are listed on the screen. This order has proven to be controversial and has been subject to extensive litigation. As I will discuss later, it ended up at the U.S. Supreme Court, and a decision was issued early last year. The last demand response focused set of orders on the screen are ones related to measurement and verification of wholesale demand response. And I will also briefly touch on these orders in a later slide. So moving on to each of the 4 different program types, the first one is demand response as a capacity resource. So basically, as a capacity resource, the demand response responds during system emergencies. They are required to respond as a condition for participating and bidding into the capacity markets, and if they do not respond, these resources will be penalized. They will receive a capacity market-based payment, which is based on the market clearing price or capacity in each of the RTOs that it participates in. There does not require instantaneous response. The activation period is typically between 30 minutes to 2 hours, but the trend is shifting this activation period to shorter periods, like 30 minutes. Programs are operated, the aggregation of the demand response are provided by electric utilities and by demand response aggregators. It does require an estimate of baseline customer demand, and I'll note that each of the ISOs and RTOs have similar but different methods for calculating that baseline demand. And it also requires extensive measurement and verification of customer response and aggregated demand response. Each of the RTOs who have a capacity market do allow demand response to participate in PJM, in the reliability pricing model, ISO New England in the forward capacity market, in New York ISO, in the ICAP Special Case Resources Program, and then in MISO, they are able to participate directly, but the primary and most of the demand response is coming in as what's known as load modifying resources, which adjusts the peak responsibility for load serving entities. The next type is known as the ancillary services programs. And in these programs, demand response offers a rapid response resource to provide operating reserve and regulation services. They can be very quick, and in regards to the regulation programs, as quick as 4 seconds. And they are operated, again, by electric utilities and demand response aggregators. The aggregators typically bid the resources in the RTO markets on behalf of the customer. And since they are required to respond quickly, they are typically provided through direct load control, automated response, or through the control of large industrial loads. The Warwick plant operated by Alcoa in the past was a good example of being able to adjust its electricity used to melt the alumina, and to be able to doing that in a very quick way, was able to provide reserves and regulation to the MISO markets. The RTOs that allow demand response to provide operating reserves include CAISO, ISO New England, MISO, NISO, and PJM. RTOs that allow demand response to provide regulation include PJM and MISO. The third type is demand bidding in energy markets. And this refers to the ability of customers to bid a price at which they will reduce demand. And if that price is economic and within the bid stack below the locational marginal price, it will be dispatched and if economic. And then the reductions need to happen, and if they don't, they will be penalized for non-performance. It requires, like the other types, an estimate of customer baseline usage. Customers can rely upon a mix of remote control, autonomous control, such as smart thermostats, and manual actions to reduce load. Most of the participants have been large industrial facilities and commercial and educational establishments. And as I'll note later, this was the focus of order number 745. I will note that the participation in these programs is a fraction of the participation seen in the capacity and ancillary services programs. Largely, this is because participation requires active bidding and monitoring of the energy markets and the capability to adjust consumption on a short notice. And not all customers have the willingness or ability to do that. The final type of, I went too far there. The final type of demand response program is what's known as voluntary emergency demand response. This refers to voluntary customer load reductions during system emergencies. The customers may receive payments based on reductions achieved. The reductions are not required. They are paid, but there's no penalties for non-performance. Aggregators or RTOs and utilities typically notify the customers of emergency conditions. And the customers can rely upon a mix of remote control, autonomous control, and manual actions to reduce load. The NYSO's Emergency Demand Response Program is a good example. These programs have proven valuable during system emergencies, particularly as a last resort method to reduce demand to relieve pressure on the system. However, since the reductions are not obligated, system planners do not rely heavily on these programs in resource adequacy determinations. This slide provides a snapshot of the potential reductions possible from demand response across the key organized wholesale market regions. And as you can, this table comes from FERC's most recent annual advanced metering and demand response report that we published back in December, and is based on ISO and RTO data that they have made public. As can be seen, as of the end of 2015, PJM had the largest demand response potential of close to 13 gigawatts, with MISO being close behind, and with SPP having the least amount of demand response potential. Note that these numbers will likely reduce due to two factors. First, due to a DC Court of Appeals decision, EPA has pulled back the ability for diesel-based emergency generators, also known as RICE generators, reciprocating internal combustion engines, to participate in emergency demand response programs. This will likely reduce the amount, since these emergency generators were used for many of the demand reductions. I don't have the exact number, but it is a fraction that will probably be observed. Second, ISOs and RTOs like PJM and ISO New England have shifted to requiring all resources in their capacity markets to be able to be dispatched throughout the year. Since many demand response programs are based on summer-based air conditioning and temperature-based systems, the ability of these resources to participate in other seasons is more difficult. So it will be interesting to see how the effect of amount of demand response in the upcoming auctions being operated by the various RTOs. Turning to back to the FERC v. EPSA case, which I noted earlier, several parties, particularly the Electric Power Supply Association, or EPSA, appealed order number 745 to the DC Court of Appeals. And in May 2014, the DC Court of Appeals vacated the order 745 in its entirety. This EPSA case was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court by the U.S. Solicitor General, and oral arguments were held on October 14, 2015. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in FERC v. EPSA in January 2016 that fully upheld FERC's jurisdiction on wholesale demand response and overturned the lower court's decision. The Supreme Court found that FERC did possess adequate regulatory authority under the Federal Power Act, and that FERC's decision to compensate demand response providers at locational marginal price was not arbitrary and capricious. And in particular, the Supreme Court found that since wholesale demand response has a direct impact on wholesale rates, it can be subject to FERC jurisdiction. My last slide has to do with, and it kind of tees up the discussion that's going to happen in the next two presenters, has to do with wholesale demand response M&V. But in the last decade, the North American Energy Standards Board, or NASB, undertook a project to develop standards for wholesale demand response M&V. And over two phases, NASB established a useful framework for measurement and verification of demand response, particularly the designation of key definitions and evaluation methodologies. And these are listed on the slide. FERC adopted these by reference in Phase 1 in 2010 in Order 676F, and in Phase 2 in February 2013 with Order number 676G. A variety of measurement and verification methods are in use at the RTOs and ISOs, largely following the framework set out by NASB. A good rough resource for these methods is the ISO RTO Council. It's a North American Demand Response Characteristics Comparison Matrix, also known as the IRC Matrix, which is on the IRC website. This matrix has a good summary of the different evaluation methodologies that are used for each of the different programs, and also is a good resource for the types of ISO and RTO demand response programs. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'll be available for questions later.
Actually, Dave, we've got a couple quick questions for you. Well, one or two quick ones, maybe one or two long ones we might end up saving for the end of the discussion. But let me just, real quick clarification. On one of the tables, you had the Southwest Power Pool. Is there a name of a program specifically in SPP for DR, do you know? Do they have a program currently?
I don't believe they have a specific program at this point. The numbers are a small number, and it's really just more direct participation in their energy markets.
Thank you. And then I was wondering if you could maybe talk for a short bit now, and we can maybe again cover it at the end if there's time, about DR programs in service territories with vertically integrated utilities versus non-vertically integrated utilities, and what the role might be of aggregators in systems with vertically integrated utilities. I don't know if that's something you or FERC have an opinion on.
Well, there is certain markets like MISO and SPP, which are comprised of many states which that did not restructure their markets, which are where vertically integrated utilities are their primary means of serving customers. And in those markets, particularly, I can talk about MISO, demand response is provided by the vertically integrated utilities, and then the vertically integrated utilities either A, bid these reductions into the wholesale markets, or in the case of in the capacity market in MISO, the various demand response programs are counted as a resource and are used to adjust the peak responsibility associated with each of the load serving entities and utilities, and when they're doing their resource adequacy determinations. So in those markets, typically aggregators are not participating directly in the wholesale market. And that's along with the direction in the order number 719 that allows if it will not be required if there are state or local regulations that do not allow them to participate.
Okay. Thank you. I think the last question, let me just mention this, and this is probably something for all of our presenters today. We'll cover at the end of the final presentation, which is where do you see things going with demand response, from a FERC perspective, from a PJM perspective, from a national DR perspective, from a California perspective. So that might be something for our presenters to think about of where they see in their crystal ball for future directions in regulation, policy, markets, etc. But leaving that as a bit of a teaser towards the end here, let me introduce our next presenter, my dear colleague and friend, Mark Martinez, a Senior Portfolio Manager for Southern California Edison, who has over 25 years' experience in the regulatory oversight and management of integrated DSM utility programs. He's been also active in developing EM&V protocols since a different millennia when he was involved with the IP-MVP. He is currently overseeing the emerging markets and technology activities at Edison and is working with a wide variety of policymakers and advocates, stakeholders, to make sure that customers, consumers can effectively shape, shift, shed, and shimmy to their heart's content. And I think Mark will probably describe what is meant by shape, shift, shed, and shimmy, new California terms, not a dance. So Mark, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, thank you, Steve, and apologies for the tongue twister, but let's get into the retail perspective on demand response. And to give our participants a little perspective, Southern California Edison has a long history of load management and demand response for the reasons of our location. Basically, we're in Southern California, which has a very strong summer peaking load, and it's over the years we've needed to maintain reliability through a number of load management programs, even installing air conditioner load switches and things like this. And as a result of the energy crisis, when we needed something more than just peak shaving programs, we really developed a robust portfolio of what I would call retail programs that vary over, that took our legacy programs and our basic interruptible rates and then developed some new programs. So what I'm showing now is our current portfolio. And when I say retail, these are programs where the utility has designed either a rate or an incentive, what we call reservation type program, where we install a switch on your air conditioner and give you a participation fee, whether you participate or not. But we do have the ability when you voluntarily join to control that. And of course, that's certainly better than the traditional system of load management, which are rotating outages over the grid. But over time, we've had the need to get more types of participation from larger customers. And we have had incentive programs where we would pay customers for reducing their energy during certain times, and also if they would bid in their capacity. So these were all the result of the dramatic events of 2001. And here we are 16 years later, still with these programs, but now changing needs over time. And to give you an example, here is what happens. This is actually a load profile of the Edison system on a particularly warm day a few years ago. And when we pushed the button with over 300,000 central air conditioners, this is the dramatic impact. So again, that's our grid operators can see that. That demonstrates the reliability. But when you get to the evaluation perspective, how can you verify what exactly happens? If you notice, there's sort of like a bite taking out of that profile. So what would the profile had been in the absence of that load control event? And that's the question that has been sort of engaging evaluation folks for a number of years, and certainly for the time that I've been involved. So what I'm going to address today is the EM&V aspect of how low did we go? And that's where the baselines come into play. A lot of folks that have been in evaluation realize that baselines are perhaps have a different definition. For example, is it an efficiency standard for an end use, or is it a operating conditions of a building and so forth? And what we're talking about is we know that we impacted energy usage for a short time. As some folks like to call, this is what saving energy in a hurry. It's a short time conservation program. And it's either done with radios or with pricing signals and so forth. But we know what the usage was during a certain number of hours, but what would it have been, you see? And that's what we like to call the counterfactual. It's sort of, you can never measure the impact, you can only estimate it. And that's, I think, the conundrum that we face. So let's look at what is required of a baseline. Baselines are what did not happen. So what is the best baseline, or how do you determine that? It's very difficult to come up with a accurate and repeatable and verifiable estimate. You can do that certainly through detailed regression analysis and so forth. But you got to remember a couple of things. Some of these programs are designed to give customers an incentive for their participation. And their participation is truly based on how they performed. So a lot of the purposes of these baselines are not only designed for determining what the impact was on the grid like we saw in that previous slide, but especially how can I possibly give customers incentive payments if I don't know how to calculate the benefit of that program. So those are the challenges that you have to deal with. Now, baselines also have a purpose going forward because, as I think Stephen said earlier, showing that a demand response program or resource or technology is beneficial and reliable is important for grid operations, right? We really want to use it when it's needed. The other thing is, of course, as I mentioned before, is the financial settlement, is how we reimburse either customers directly or an aggregated group of customers or different participants. And then for planning, if you have sort of a program at the ready, if it's a summer program, how does it work in the winter? If it's a program that's only good for certain times of the year, how can it be dependent on? So we really need to look at a number of what we call the ex-ante performance. In other words, how can I forecast this program going forward? And that's something that we've dealt with as well. So let's talk about the different types of baselines. And going back to David's earlier presentation, I've worked on the NASB protocols at the wholesale markets. I've also been engaged with developing a lot of baselines early on when we first designed our programs. But fundamentally, the basic baseline type number one for demand response is taking a look at what a customer had done historically. So if you were able to go back in time and say, look, this customer typically uses this type of energy on these types of days, so that should be representative of what they did on this particular day. And the challenge here, of course, is, like they say in the stock market, right? The past history is no performance of either present or future performance. But that's sort of like the best we can do because we have historical meter data. And if we go back and we pick a certain number of days or look at certain types of performance, we can estimate what the baseline is. And then the other thing, too, is, for example, let's say that we hit a program to do some peak shaving on the hottest day of the year. Well, I mean, the days that were happening maybe in the last few days were raining, or maybe they were not hot or something like that. So that's not really a representative day. So a lot of times what we can do is we can adjust the baseline either with a temperature factor or some other adjustment to sort of give it a better representation. And here's some explanation of that. So we talk about the X and Y. For a rapid settlement of this, let's say we call an event today, right? Here it is in the middle of April. And for 4 hours, what I will have to do is go back in time and look at similar days of what these customer groups were doing and collect the data from that period, and that's what we call our Y values. We can go back 5 days or 10 days or a lot of days. And of course, I don't want to use any days where there was already a DR event, right? And I don't want to use any weekends when nobody was in the buildings. And I want to avoid holidays. So I want to be fair, and I want to show a representative days. And then what we will do, depending on the nature of the program that we're in, we will sort of cherry pick the days that best represent the event day. So if it was a hot day, we want to pick the hottest days. And that's what I'm showing in the example of X. It's called the high 5 of 10. Now, as many types of programs and states and markets there are lots of different types of baselines. And I'm going to go into that understanding a little bit in the future down the slides here. But so that's our basic approach. We will take a subset of days out of a set of days ahead of time and pull that into, and then you can very easily make the settlement. And what I'm showing next is an example of how we do it for two of our programs. We have two current demand response programs. One is called capacity bidding, where a customer on a month-to-month basis bids in and says, for the month of May or June, I figure I can drop about maybe 200 kW or a couple of megawatts. And so, knowing that you will settle my performance and pay me on a kW basis based on this baseline. Now here, we're using the 10 and 10 baseline approach. And as I've mentioned, over the years, we've gone through a number of different approaches. We've gone through the 5 and 10, 3 and 10. We currently have a 3 and 5 for residential customers. And I'll explain why the variations in those different approaches. But here you can see that we've looked at the previous 10 days, and these are non-event days, and we average in their values, and then we put that into the system. So we come up with a representative day, and then we will look at how the event performs. And then, of course, on the next slide, I'm showing you how we did that. The dark blue line is the baseline that came out of that calculation. But then look at the magenta color. That was the customer's performance. And they say, wait a minute, you're undervaluing my usage with this baseline because those previous 10 days were cool days, or maybe business was not as slow and so forth. So when you compare my blue line to my performance, I'm only getting half the value. So what we've done for certain programs is we put in an adjustment factor to better represent what the true load drop was. And again, this is, to encourage participation. We certainly want to have customers participate because of baseline issues. We've actually had customers that have dropped significant load, but because of their baseline, they didn't get any compensation. And that's not really a fair way to deal with their willingness to provide this type of level of service. So that's where we've made adjustments over the years to try to better represent how customers' load performance has occurred. So that's the first approach. Now, if you've got thousands and thousands of individual customers, and it's going to be very difficult unless you have a very good customer service billing system, automated and so forth. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll do a sampling approach. And this has become popular because now as we roll out time of use programs and critical peak pricing programs among mass markets, and we have aggregators that come in and bring in hundreds and hundreds of customers, that will use a sampling approach. And this is the kind of approach that we used for our AC cycling program for years before we had AMI meters installed. So that was really an important factor. And then, of course, as we go in with larger programs, we are now able to use what I call the traditional experimental designs that energy efficiency has done if we can have some non-participants in there and develop control groups. So there has been different approaches depending on the different types of programs that we have. But there are programs and there are customers that don't really work for baselines. And I'll give you an example. We have an interruptible tariff. We have very large customers that provide 2 to 10 megawatts. These are either mining or process customers, and their operations are very intermittent. And so all we ask them to do, rather than to have a baseline approach, is we just say, can you come down to a firm service level? So we will ask them, to just drop their load to a certain level, and if they can meet that level, we pretty much know based on their normal operations over time that we have a reduced demand. And so we have about 600 megawatts of customers in this program. We don't run baselines on them, but we use them as an interruptible service, and they are an excellent contingency that we can depend on. And their payment is not based on their performance. Their payment is based on an anticipated and expected performance based on the previous year's demand. And this is what we call a reservation approach. In other words, we will compensate them in advance with a billing credit, and it sort of keeps them at the ready. The other approach that has been used for very large and dramatic drops is what we call the before meter and after meter. So again, this is not a baseline methodology, but as I talk about the different types of demand response, what Jenny was showing earlier, the shape, shed, shift, and shimmy, that taxonomy of family of DR is mostly because of one thing, and that's the solar that is coming in California. The solar is causing us to have a lot of capacity, and there the need for capacity shed may not be relevant as much as the ability to shift your load or the ability to ramp up your load. So we're exploring lots of different approaches and new models of demand response in California. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of time a large customer like a process industry and so forth will have a highly variable load. And what this means is that 10 days of baseline doesn't work for them. They are off 3 days, they're back on a few days, but yet when we need them, they can drop significant load. And this can happen in water agencies, process industries, and so forth. So these folks, over the years, we've realized baseline approaches don't really work for them. They need to be in a different kind of program, or they may be disappointed, or they may not be properly compensated for the load drop. So all the day of adjustment in the world may not help them. And that's where we need to have customers identify them ahead of time. I think there's been some excellent programs where pre-screening a customer and looking at their historical usage before they join a program is going to be very important. Because when you get down to it, ultimately you have to not only look at what customers are using, but also how we can tease out the settlements. And for a handful of large customers, that may not be a challenge, but when you have a robust portfolio like we do, and we have lots of different customers in there, there is really a big issue in getting proper compensation, because demand response is a relationship, right? It's a continuous relationship with customers. They can opt in or they can opt out. And when it comes down to really participating in something where we call this, short-term conservation, that's an important component for us. So my takeaway here is, over the years, I think that the best recommendation I can give for trying to do the proper evaluation is that when you've got highly variable load customers in a baseline program, it's going to be very difficult to make it work. You really need to get the right customer on the right program. The small graph I'm showing there kind of shows the variability of the different customer sectors. Everything from, like I said before, water agencies, industrials, even schools that have special days and so forth. They're very difficult to get those folks in. So the repeatable, highly continuous operations are good for that. And then design programs where the highly volatile can do well and that sort of thing. So that kind of shows the history we've been dealing with over the last 15 years and so in the retail sector, and we're still going strong. And I understand that every utility, municipal and co-op, is in the same space as we are. So hopefully that gives a little perspective on where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for that very thorough presentation. There was a couple of clarifying questions that came in while you were speaking, but I think as you proceeded through your presentation, you covered most of them. There was one I just want to check with you real quick before we get to our final presentation, and then a group discussion on where things are going with demand response. have you seen a fatigue in your customers with demand response, particularly any rate-based DR, where consumers after a period of time just stop participating or not, ignoring the signals?
We've been using our AC cycling program as an emergency resource for years. Customers joined it to help save the grid. We integrated the program into our local energy markets, and now we've been using it multiple times over the last few years, and we have seen a decrease in participation. And so that is one of the challenges of continuous operation of your programs, where the customer expectation is one thing and then the fulfillment is another.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, let's get to our last presentation. Last but certainly not least, as you will see, as we are very fortunate to have Pete Langbein here. He's the manager of demand-side response operations of the PJM Interconnection. Pete's been with the PJM Interconnection for 10 years, and he manages the participation of demand response resources that represent actually over 2 million customers, or 10,000 megawatts, in the delivery of energy capacity and ancillary services. Prior to joining PJM, Pete spent around 10 years in the competitive retail electricity markets across North America and 3 years at an investor-owned utility. He has extensive experience in these wholesale and retail markets, and so I think we're very fortunate to have him here to talk about EM&V and demand response in the wholesale markets. Thanks, Pete.
Great. I want to say thanks to Steve and the LB&L folks for inviting me today to participate in this webinar. It's always a pleasure to talk about demand response and EM&V. Just to give folks a real quick heads up, for those that may not be familiar with PJM, PJM Interconnection is located basically in the Mid-Atlantic plus part of the Midwest. So we go from the Chicagoland area across and down to North Carolina and up through New Jersey. There's some stats on the slide regarding that service territory, where we represent 13 states and the District of Columbia for 65 million people. We do have the opportunity to serve both jurisdictions that serve retail power under a vertically integrated approach, as well as those that have a competitive retail electricity market. So when we approach DR and we look at things in the market, we are trying to make sure that we can meet all the different possibilities. One note, I thought Mark did an excellent job kind of going through many of the different EM&V approaches and thoughts in the retail market. In the wholesale market, we are trying to do very similar, if not the same type of things. One of the key differences sometimes become what is it that we're trying to measure. From a demand response standpoint in the wholesale markets, the reason we have demand response is that it allows us another form of resource to provide wholesale services and products. So that helps increase the pool of potential for us to be able to use resources to ultimately meet supply-demand balance. If you can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So real quick, I just want to start with the overall EM&V framework in terms of what are we really shooting for here when we're trying to come up with an approach to determine what happened for demand response. Keep in mind, in the traditional world of generation, when we're trying to figure out what happened, it's easy. What was the output at that moment in time? As Mark and some of the other panelists have mentioned, in the world of DR, we need to figure out what would have happened in order to determine what that actual difference was in providing that service. So we've really broken this out into 4 different key ingredients for success. One, all around empirical performance. If we're talking about how do we measure and evaluate something, we need to determine is our estimator of how we're doing it. Is it accurate? Is it biased? Does it have a tendency to overestimate or underestimate? And how variable is that estimate? How close am I to the pin when I'm actually estimating what would have happened? Am I always on the green? Am I off in the rough? We need to get a good sense for how that CBL, customer baseline, or load forecast is actually operating. Another ingredient, that's out there is transparency. Whatever we come up with to use for things like baselines, are they easy to use and understand and communicate? At the end of the day, this is an actual customer that's going to be adjusting their load patterns. Customers are not in the business to reduce and change load. They do this, to help, mitigate issues on the grid. They do this to, earn revenue, to potentially, mitigate costs and risks on their side. But it's a secondary thing. So we want to make sure it's clear and can be communicated and understood, and also needs to be able to be, replicated and audited. So since this is driving financial results, it needs to be able to be replicated by other folks, so that it's not a black box where people are not confident of outcomes. Third one I have down here is around just cost to administer. Whatever we come up with in the EM&V framework, people need to implement this and administer it across the spectrum of participants. So in the wholesale market, we have the electric distribution company, which is the utility, load serving entity, who's ever responsible for the actual load. There may be an aggregator, in the mix. You have a customer, and in the case of the wholesale market, we have the independent system operator or regional transmission organization. Fourth one is around mitigating gaming or minimizing self-selection bias. Whoever's participating in the market, if they're deciding when they participate, and we know that we are working with an estimate to begin with, we just want to make sure that we have a way to do that on a non-biased basis, and that it's not open to things like let me do my demand reductions when, for example, my school may already be on spring break and things of that nature, when the expectation is something different will occur on that day. So again, the measurement that we're doing is really driving both revenue opportunities and the associated penalties that may come up. Next slide, please. So from a wholesale market standpoint, I thought David did a great job kind of covering this. The one note I just really want to make here is that EM&V strategy will vary potentially by the market that you're looking at or the service that you're looking at. That could also be seen in the retail side from a program standpoint. The way we do things in the energy market may be different than the way we do things in the capacity market, because they actually represent different services that we're trying to achieve. Ancillary services as well tend to be very short-term in nature. We handle them differently than we would in the energy market. I was going to spend a little time now focusing a little bit more on the energy market and how we're doing some specific things. Next slide, please. So customer baseline load, CBL, again, to reiterate some of Mark's thoughts, we're really forecasting what that load would have been if they hadn't reduced load. And all the way back to Stats 101, when you're dealing with things like forecasts or estimates, you really get into balancing two different type of errors, because all estimates will have errors over time. That's why they are estimates. We can't predict the future with perfect precision. And really those errors kind of come into balancing a type 1 error, which is really around when you're estimating a load reduction, but maybe the customer didn't actually reduce load, versus a type 2 error, which is where you're estimating no load reduction, but the customer did reduce load. Those two things, if we try to just adhere to one, we will increase the error in the other one. So we're trying to balance those two objectives with whatever approach that we use in order to, estimate or forecast that customer's load in the future. Again, ultimately we're trying to look at those 4 quadrants that we've set up in the beginning around the framework, and here, I'm highlighting around maximizing that accuracy and minimizing the bias and variability, but errors will occur. Next slide, please. Wanted to lay out a little bit around a process, that we are using today, and some other folks may use as well. I think Mark spoke to things like a screen. What we've laid out here is just a pretty simplified process. Since we're dealing with estimates, one of the important things is how do we objectively evaluate whether or not the estimate's going to do a good job or not, right? Sounds pretty basic, but it's very important when we're in this world. That way we know, first and foremost, hey, do we have a way to reasonably predict load in the future? Mark spoke to things like highly variable loads. We may not be able to predict them, which makes things very difficult, or could be impossible to determine a load reduction if you can't actually predict the future load. So what we've set up is a process where we have some form of a default CBL where we've seen it perform well in the past. We've created what I'm referring to here as a CBL test. And the CBL test, in effect, is saying, let me take a time slice of your load data. I know what you actually did, and let's say I know that there are no events going on in that historic period. And if I look at that history, let me go ahead and create CBLs that estimate what you would have done, and let me compare them to what you actually did when there were no events. And when I do that, I can actually then I can calculate empirical performance. In this case, we're using something called a relative root mean square error. It could be other types of tests, but that way I can benchmark how accurate, how variable, how biased those estimates seem to be doing looking back at history when I know what that customer did, and I can compare it to an estimate at that point. So what we've done is we'll run that test. We've come up with basically a rough scorecard that says, hey, if you can get to this level, it's reasonably accurate, let's use the CBL. If you don't get to that relative accuracy number we're looking for, then we have basically an alternative CBL process where we have a variety of CBLs that may be more appropriate for a given load pattern, and the ability to actually create a brand new CBL if we need to, over time. And then we would run that one back through the CBL test. The idea is to have a process that helps us continue to build and improve the CBLs. Again, to Mark's point, if customers do things and then they don't get compensated, that's an issue, right? We're trying to find a real a accurate way to make sure people are compensated for what they're doing relative to what they're supposed to do. So this gives us a nice little simple way to do that. It's a consistent approach across the market, so that one type of retail store in one area may use the same type of CBL in another area. They're not all of a sudden using different CBLs because somebody maybe wants to use a different CBL. We look at the performance and we apply the CBL accordingly. Next slide, please. This is just a quick list of CBL inventory that we have today. I think we may have a few others, but this is roughly the majority of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but what we've seen is our CBL inventory really hasn't been growing a whole lot lately. It did, it did when we first, a few years ago, especially in the post-order 745 world. Where we were having more new loads that were coming into the market that we were trying to estimate, and we spent some time working with our members to develop different CBLs to better match their load. This goes through a variety from let's just use your load on your particular day, but where the load occurs before the event versus the load during the event to actually estimate what you would have done during the event, to a bunch of different methods that Mark was highlighting as well, where we're trying to predict future load based on historic load and make some adjustments, either through adjustments based on weather or just adjustments based on how the load compares. And I thought Mark's slide did a great job of illustrating that as well. Next slide, please. This is just a quick look graph of this back test, or that CBL test, that we do. Real quick, so this graph is basically showing you the dotted purple line is load on that particular day. There was no event on that day. So what we've done is we've simulated and said, well, what happens if I looked at load, I make believe, or let's say that there was an event where I'm trying to predict the load in hour ending 14 through hour ending 19, and that's the gray shaded area. So let's say that these are hours that we want to predict. We know what the load actually was. We didn't have an event. How did the CBLs perform or estimate that actual load? So the blue line that, with the little diamond marks that, starts up high, goes down, and goes straight across and ramps down, did not do a good job of estimating what that purple dotted line was. That was the simple 3+2, where we simply said, let's look at their usage before the event and after, average it to tell us what they would have done. In this case, that doesn't work because this is much more of a shaped profile. We would also know that numerically if we looked at the RMSC test results. The other two that I have there are our simple default CBL, which, to Mark's point, it could be 5 of 10, 3 of 4. In our case, it's 4 or 5 with an adjustment, are the red blocks. That one did a better job of estimating than our green line, which is what we call our match day approach. There's a visual way to do it. Again, we're running hundreds and thousands of these, which is why we are using an actual numeric benchmark, in our case the RMSC, to determine which one is better, so that we're not physically looking through all these type of tests. Next slide, please. Quick note. So the CBL is primarily calculated I think of it as a premise level or the utility account number. That's the level that we are determining the CBL. From a participation standpoint, if we have small premises, they can get aggregated together so that there is enough load or load reduction to be able to participate in the market, and our minimum participation threshold is 100 kW. When we do that aggregation, then we will aggregate up the load, calculate an aggregate CBL, and then we use that to measure the load reduction. And the third point is, in things like the capacity market, we aggregate results in a portfolio for whatever is dispatched. So one of the nice things, with DR being diversified, we will aggregate results. So if one, depending on what we dispatch and things like locational constraints, if one particular entity or one, customer, performs better than maybe another one was expected to do, we will aggregate those results so we can look at the net to determine whether or not that resource met their obligation. Next slide, please. Just a few thoughts. So capacity market, EM&V is, from our standpoint, is based more on avoided demand. That's similar to when Mark was talking about firm service level. Since we've procured a certain amount of capacity for a customer to ensure their reliability, if they know that their load, if they reduce load, they're going to be at or below a given number, then that will be their benchmark. For example, if they're a 10 megawatt customer and they have a 10 megawatt capacity allocation and they say, listen, you tell me when you have an issue and I'll make sure my load is no higher than 5 megawatts, then 5 megawatts will be the benchmark for them. Another quick note, with migration from hourly energy settlements to things like 5-minute energy settlements, which will mean we will have a much shorter time frame to estimate. Shorter time frames typically mean higher variation, which could mean greater error. These are things we're going to need to look at in the future as wholesale, I know from a PJM standpoint, as we move down the path into things like 5-minute energy settlements. Sophisticated approaches do not necessarily mean that they're more accurate. We've benchmarked a bunch of different approaches as we've looked at our CBL test. Things like the regression approach, we found it, if it can be marginally more accurate, it may not be more accurate. It really depends, which is why it's nice to kind of have an objective way to determine the performance of different estimators. On the ancillary services side, we tend to look at, since it's very shorter in duration, we tend to look at things more like load before versus load after, really as the proxy for CBL, because within that defined period there is not as much variation or shaping, I should probably say. As the data availability goes up, in my mind, we will be able to improve accuracy over time, in terms of CBL and CBL performance. Next slide. And this was just some reference material, for you all, if you are interested. Please go out there and take a look at this. This is some work that's been done over time. And then I also have in the appendix some more details around the RMSC, an example of how that's being calculated. That's all that I had for my presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Pete, and thank you to other speakers. I do want to take a few more minutes here if each of our panelists would be interested in just talking, say for a minute about where you see demand response going within your jurisdictions, within your purviews, your experience. What do you think's next for demand response, the challenges and opportunities and scale? And I don't know, maybe we can go in order of presenters. Jenny, put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I muted my line. So there was a really good question that came through from Joel Gilbert. I'm not sure what organization he was at, but he was asking about, in California particularly, what is, what's happening to demand response programs in regards to the needs of the grid, given increased PV penetration, and that really takes us to what's happening on the grid in general as we introduce grid scale renewables as well as storage, and then also just distributed energy resources. Demand response is going to change its tune. In California in particular, we're seeing a decreased need in peak capacity type programs because we have renewables on the grid and just adequate capacity. The DR potential study for California looked at this, and really, and Mark had mentioned, or I guess it was Steve, talking about the shape, shed, shift, and shimmy. The potential study that we conducted at the lab found that there's a new type of DR that's going to become more and more prevalent in terms of shape being represented by time-based pricing, and then faster response demand response, the faster response demand response, such as load following demand response and also regulation demand response, will be providing services in almost real time to handle the volatility, not only at the distribution system level, but at the grid scale level. And then you're going to have a new type of product that can be handled with retail rates, or it can also be handled with automation at the system level, which is called a shift type resource, which is absorbing excess capacity produced by photovoltaics as they are increased in number and in scale throughout the systems, whether it's in California, Hawaii, or any other area within the next 10 years. You're going to need to have demand-side resources that are capable of absorbing or moving load throughout the day to really help smooth out that load profile. That need is quickly approaching. We've seen the duck curve. The duck curve in California is a great example of this, and really trying to smooth out the demand to absorb some of that excess supply is going to be a critical need within the next 5 to 10 years in CAISO. So that's where I see it going.
Maybe, I don't know, going random order here, maybe Mark, Jenny was talking about California. I don't know if you have more to add about from an Edison perspective as to where things are heading.
Well, this is Mark, and it's not so much about California, but I think that all jurisdictions across the country are seeing that the demand response has a uneven distribution of advancement. I mean, some folks are doing very well with demand 1.0, reducing their marginal procurements, providing local grid reliability. Other folks are looking at local distribution impacts and trying to get local net benefits out of that. And then now we've got batteries, we've got solar panels, there's all sorts of stuff going on where just being able to communicate with your end users and being able to provide customers the choice. You don't want some draconian system turning themselves off, but now the new demand response is a two-way street with enabling customers to either participate or not participate or reduce their costs. And I think that's the real value. So we're seeing a real dynamic shift of this traditional load management to one more of a relationship model.
And Dave, I'm going to leave you from the federal FERC, Dave perspective for our final comment on this, but maybe turn to Pete in the Mid-Atlantic and East there, where you see things heading.
Sure, Steve. So, a few different things. In the future, I think sophistication for things like aggregation and portfolio optimization. I think that's really, going to take another big step. And, instead of, fleets of resources doing things, but people getting much more sophisticated in terms of, which, particular customer within their fleet does what for how long to, do things like minimize business impact or, comfort on people and things of that nature. That's what will help continue to make DR a little more homogeneous with some of the traditional resources that are out there, and really leverage the flexibility that's inherent in DR resources, and that flexibility, as automation, control, and optimization, continue to increase, I think is going to help us meet more of our ancillary service requirements with that DR flexibility, into the future.
And Dave, you want to sum up the future for us?
Sum up the future. I'm not sure about that, but problem with going last is that everybody else has basically said what I was going to say. I'm in agreement with what has been said by the three others. I think that we're moving into a demand response 3.0 type of environment in which the technology and with the needs and the changes in the load shapes due to things like solar PV, et cetera, are going to create a different need for a demand response or for load adjustments and curtailments. So I think is the trend that we'll be seeing. And that's also a trend we also, back in 2009, FERC did a national assessment of demand response potential. And the largest potential we saw was going to be coming from the combination of a more real-time pricing and automated responses, is where there definitely could be a strong potential for meeting peak or meeting loads. The one thing I will also say is that I do think that there always will be, this is my personal opinion, a need for a demand response as a reliability resource. That a system operator, whether it's a local municipal or a system operator like PJM, will still see some benefit from a emergency-based demand response. And I think that those types of resources, I don't believe are going to go away.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank again our panel, our presenters, Jenny, Dave, Mark, and Pete, for presenting what I think was just, in my unbiased opinion, an excellent presentation of overview of what's happening with demand response, what it is, and what the measurement and verification issues and opportunities and ways that we do that. Hopefully provide some good information. There's a lot more resources out there. For the audience, thank you for joining us, and this is recorded, will be available to share with families and friends and colleagues, and there's a wealth of other resources available, some of them up on the screen now, but also through LBL as well as FERC, NASB, PJM, Edison, and other locations on the web that you can find a great deal of information. So thank you very much to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next EM&V webinar late in May. Take care, and thank you very much.